Good day, duelists! Welcome to the next installment of Mr. Bazat's top 10 cards of each civilization series. So far we've covered light and darkness, and in this video we're going to be doing water. So, top 10 water civilization cards. As per usual, a quick reminder, I am rating these based on competitive viability first, which means how many decks does this card see play in, how good are said decks, and how important the card is in said decks, as well as how a card represents its civilization. So in this case, how much does this card make me want to add water into my deck? With that out of the way, let's start with a couple honorable mentions. First honorable mention, Thrashcrawler. It's a solid blocker that lets you return a card from your mana zone to your hand. Of course, early on this is a downside, but late game it becomes an upside as it gives you access to one of those expensive cards that you charged early on. Unfortunately, Belix does this better for spells, and Soulsop does this better for creatures, so Thrashcrawler only manages to see limited play here and there. Notably, it's oftentimes played as a one-off in the Ruby deck out, which is a pretty strong deck, but it's just barely not enough to make the list, especially since it doesn't really represent the water civilization, nor is it generally the reason why you would want to add water into your deck. And secondly, perhaps a very controversial one, Coral didn't make the list. This is the card that many new Duel Masters players, or players that just haven't played that much in competitive environments or with the latest sets, think is the most batshit crazy card ever. And I myself used to think that this is the most batshit crazy card ever. But the more you play, against good decks especially, you start to realize the downsides of this card. You can separate Coral into two distinct effects: return a card to hand and skip your opponent's next draw. The thing is, aggressive and tempo decks don't really care about the skip draw part, and can do the return to hand part cheaper and more efficiently with other cards we'll maybe see later in this list. And control decks, they like the skip draw part, but now the return to hand part is a bit underwhelming. Because if you're a control deck playing against aggro, 5 mana for a bounce effect is just way too slow, and if you're playing against another control decks, it's oftentimes even a downside, as most often you're forced to return a Faliga or Belix or some other card with a good come into play effect that can then be replayed. And just in general, modern control decks have better things to do than skipping a draw. Coral still manages to find a home in some decks, but it's just sadly not enough to make this list. And with those out of the way, let's move on to the actual top 10, starting of course with number 10, Crystal Spin Slicer. Liquid People is one of the best races in Water Civilization, so it's not that surprising to see Liquid People evolutions on this list. This being a blocker is not all that relevant, but being a 2 mana 5000 beatstick is. It dodges most fire removal like Burst Shot or Tornado Flame because of its high power, and because it's an evolution it also dodges things like Miraculous Snare, and your opponent doesn't really want to cast Soulsop on this either, since they're giving you 2 mana cards. So overall it's just very annoying to deal with. It usually comes out on turn 2, following a 2-1 Aqua Guard, or it's played from hand as a speed attacker, again most ideally for 3 mana together with an Aqua Guard. So aggressive water decks without fire really like this card since they wouldn't have access to speed attackers otherwise, but unfortunately that's a pretty narrow range of decks. Most notably this is played in Water Dark aggro, but that's pretty much the only place where it's managed to successfully find a home, which is why I can't put it any higher than number 10. Number 9. Emerald. One of the best and most hyped up water cards of the early Duel Masters, now a little less so but still not forgotten. It's Emerald, of course. When played, this little guy allows you to swap out one of your shields for a card in your hand, allowing you to place a shield trigger, or just to get rid of a dead card in your hand in order to effectively draw a new one. Being a 2 mana creature, it's most effective in decks that want cheap creatures on the board, meaning aggressive decks. The problem with that is almost every civilization has better 2-drops. Fire has Snip Strike and Cook Polon, Nature has Quixotic, Darkness has Spinning Terror, just to name a few. This makes Emerald a very difficult card to include in your deck, which is why it's only seeing limited play nowadays, and why it's only number 9 in this list. Still, you might have noticed that Light was absent from the list of civilization with strong 2-drops, which is why Emerald does see play in some strong decks like Lightwater Azonius or Lightwater Nature Arcadias. It also sees plays in lists that care about Cyberlords such as Hydrus or Starnoid, but those types of decks tend to not be very competitive nowadays. Closing notes on Emerald. The order of the effects is that you first put a card from hand and then you take a shield. And honestly, this card would probably just jump 1 or 2 position in the ranking if it were the other way around. Nothing sucks more than, for example, setting down a Spiral Gate with Emerald's effect, only to then pick up an Aqua Surfer in its place. Not only because now you have a weaker trigger, but also now you have a metaphorical red arrow pointing over your Spiral Gate saying, attention, this might be a trigger, whereas the Aqua Surfer you picked up would have been a complete surprise. Number 8 goes to Hydro Hurricane. We can't talk about water cards without of course mentioning Hydro Hurricane. This beast of a spell gets rid of both your opponent's board and mana zone depending on how many light and dark creatures you have, and usually ends the game on its own when played in the right game state. It is the centerpiece and namesake of the deck it's played in, which is Light Water Dark Hydro Hurricane, and the bounce to hand effect definitely represents the water civilization. Even lore-wise, water was the only civilization that remained neutral and supported both light and darkness in the war from Shadow Clash, so the flavor is definitely there in this card. The only reason why Hydro Hurricane is not higher up on the list is because, well, it pretty much only sees play in this one deck, which is not surprising given that you kinda need to build your entire deck around it. But yeah, it turns out that there are a lot of great water cards out there that are simply easier to include in a variety of different competitive decks, which sadly means that Hydro Hurricane cannot be placed higher than number 8. Number 7. Crystal Paladin. The second Liquid People evolution on this list, Crystal Paladin causes a big splash when played, returning all blockers in the battle zone to their owner's hands. Released all the way back in DM02, this card still holds up to this day. A very iconic card for the water civilization, its effect to get rid of blockers obviously best shines in aggressive water lists, so it should come as no surprise that a lot of successful aggressive water decks run at least one copy of this card. I had to put Paladin above Crystal Spin Slicer because in my opinion at least Paladin is more of a centerpiece / build around card, plus it sees play in both Water Fire and Water Dark, and just in general it's more easily splashable. It is still limited to aggressive lists though, and generally only run at 1 or 2 copies, so all things considered, I think number 7 is fitting for this iconic card. Number 6. Unicorn Fish. 4 mana body that bounces a card to hand. Insanely good in tempo decks if you are already ahead on board, getting rid of the opponent's board presence while at the same time increasing yours. This is the card that kind of overshadows Coral in today's meta environment because the two cards kind of share the same purpose, but one of them costs 1 mana less, which is huge for decks where the bounce is most relevant, i.e. aggressive or tempo oriented decks. Sure, you don't get the skip draw effect of Coral, but like we discussed in the Darkness Top 10 video in the comparison between Jeweled Scarab and Propeller Mutant, denying your opponent resources is just not a priority in aggro decks because you're giving your opponent cards in the form of shields anyway. Hence, Unicorn Fish has found its home in many competitive decks such as Water Fire Rush, Water Dark Aggro, Water Fire Nature Tempo, and even in some versions of Bombazar Blue if you want to count that. Its effect also encompasses one of the Water Civilization's main mechanics, which is returning to hand. It's almost never run at max copies in any deck though, usually preferring to have 2 or even just 1 of them, and it's almost always an afterthought of having water and not a centerpiece of any deck, which is why I'm quite surprised myself that I'm putting it this highly on the list, but seeing just how many decks it fits in because of how splashable it is in any aggressive deck that runs water, I don't think it would be fair to rank it any lower than number 6. Number 5 goes to Lucky Ball. This is probably the card that most incentivizes people to add water to their aggressive lists. 4 mana 3000 body that draws 2 cards. Of course the stipulation is that your opponent needs to be at 3 or less shields, but with aggressive lists, breaking 2 or more shields by turn 4 is oftentimes achievable. But where this card really shines is in the mid to late game. The aggro game plan generally involves dumping your entire hand early on, then after you run out of steam, all of a sudden you top deck Lucky Ball and bam, you're back into it just like that. You've developed another body on board and refueled your resources for next turn. Just like the previous entry on this list, Unicorn Fish, It finds a place in pretty much all aggro or tempo decks we've talked about so far, i.e. Water Fire Rush, Water Dark Aggro, Water Fire Nature Tempo, but it usually comes at more copies than Unicorn Fish, and it is arguably more of a reason for using the Water Civilization, so I think it definitely deserves to be higher up on the list. Unfortunately, because of its 3 shield limitation, it is still only restricted to decks that like to go in early, which is why there are still 4 cards above it on this list. Number 4, none other than Aqua Surfer. Remember Unicorn Fish from before? Well, Aqua Surfer is that, but it's a shield trigger. And that shield trigger ability, it makes one heck of a difference. Sure, it costs 2 mana more, which makes it worse when used from hand, but on the flip side, when they do hit that Aqua Surfer and shields, in many situations it is the best trigger that you can have in the entire game. Imagine you're facing a rush deck. They play turn 1 Deadly Fighter Braid Claw, turn 2 they play some random shit, and Deadly Fighter breaks your first shield. And it's an Aqua Surfer. All of a sudden the Surfer bounces whatever they played on turn 2, attacks into the Braid Claw and destroys it, and now you've just gone from your opponent having 2 creatures to them having 0 and you having 1. At that point against Rush, the duel is pretty much just over, you've won, all because of this one shield. The fact that it's a liquid people as well is relevant because of some other cards that we've seen on this list. And just to further solidify why I'm not including Coral in this list, the thing is Coral fits perfectly in the middle between Unicorn Fish and Aqua Surfer, and like, if your deck is fast, a 4 mana card is just infinitely better than a 5 mana one, so you're going to be playing Unicorn Fish, and if your deck is slower, you might as well go 1 mana up to Aqua Surfer and take the chance that you just instantly win against Rush sometimes. Again, there is a middle ground and there is a home for Coral out there, it's just awkward. And that home has not been performing very well in recent tournaments. Okay, that's the last time we'll talk about Coral in this video, let's move on with the list. Number 3. Spiral Gate, with the best of the 3 Spiral Gate artworks, the pink hair. This is a card that I myself have been underestimating for the longest of time, and just recently I have started to see its true potential. The thing is, Spiral Gate is just so versatile. If you're playing a control deck, you can use it early on against fast decks to delay their plays, but you can also use it on your own creatures to reactivate come into play effects like Thaliga, Fortress Shell, Locomotiver, and so on. You can even use it as an extra ramp card if you have Bronze Arm Tribe on board. If you play Bat on turn 3, you are now at 5 mana, which is exactly how much you need to Spiral Gate and replay the Bronze Arm Tribe. But in aggressive decks too, it's a cheap way to temporarily get rid of blockers to keep exerting pressure on your opponent's shields, but you can also use it against other aggressive decks to remove things like Gonta so they can't kill your creatures. On top of all of that, it's also a shield trigger, which is sometimes the line between winning or losing a duel. It's not a flashy card though, it's kinda the definition of Jack of all trades, master of none. It's decent removal, decent for replaying your things, decent for getting rid of blockers, decent to have in your shields, but it's never the best option in any of those categories. In addition, it often fights for deck slots with the previous card on this list, Aqua Surfer, since they're both shield triggers that return something to hand. How many of each you want in your deck depends on the deck itself. Some play full Surfers, some full Spiral Gates, some a mix of both. At the end of the day, I could see Surfer and Spiral Gate swapping places on this list, but for now I think Spiral Gate is just a little more versatile, which is why I'll put it at number 3. Number 2. Aqua Hulkus. Perhaps one of the most iconic cards in Duel Masters, Aqua Hulkus draws you a card when it enters the battle zone. But why is that so good? Well, in Duel Masters, in order to play a creature, you need to not only pay its mana cost, but also a card from your hand. But with Aqua Hulkus, you don't care about that second part, it just replaces itself when you play it by drawing you another card. This means that it makes for a solid turn 3 play if you want to broaden your options for the following turns, but it's especially good in top deck scenarios. Normally, if you are top decking, you can summon exactly 1 threat every single turn, which can usually be dealt with by your opponent's cards, because he's also drawing 1 card per turn, so if they manage to 1-for-1 your things, you cannot develop. But when you play Aqua Hulkus, you've developed 1 threat and you drew another, and you might even be able to play it with your remaining mana because Aqua Hulkus is cheap, and all of a sudden you've summoned 2 creatures at once, which are generally much more difficult to deal with than just one. There's just not a lot of cards that give you both board presence and card advantage at the same time for this cheap. And again, the fact that it's a liquid people is relevant for evolution purposes. The only catch with Aqua Halcus is that it needs a deck that actually cares about having creatures on board, so it's usually skipped in the heaviest of control decks in favor of other cards, but in everything else from Water Fire Rush, Water Dark Aggro, Water Fire Nature Tempo, Light Water Azonius, Light Water Nature Acadias, and many others, Halcus is seen at max copies in all of those, which is why it fully deserves the number 2 spot on this list. There's just one more card that barely tops this one. And the number 1 water card is of course Energy Stream. 3 mana, draw 2. Such a simple effect. Yet if you're running a control deck with the Water Civilization, this right here is most likely the reason why you decided to add water in your deck in the first place. And if you're running a control deck without water, you most likely need some way to cover the lack of this card, for example a lot of search with cards like Phobos. Drawing 2 cards is just so strong, especially in control mirrors. It's a good play early game on turn 3 and it's an amazing draw when top decking, which tends to happen a lot when facing control decks. In addition to seeing play at 4 copies in every single water control deck out there, it also sees play, most often at 4 copies also, in some mid-range decks such as Hydro Hurricane, or even in some aggressive decks that really need to dig for specific cards, best example being Lightwater Azonius or Bombazar Blue if you want to include that. Because it sees such widespread play and because it is the reason that pushes duelists to run Water Civilization in the first place, and because this is just the perfect embodiment of what water does, draw 2 cards, no extra bullshit, I think Energy Stream just has to be number 1 on this list. So there we go, those are the top 10 water cards on Mr. Bazat's list. In order we have again Energy Stream, Aqua Halcus, Spiral Gate, Aqua Surfer, Lucky Ball, Unicorn Fish, Crystal Paladin, Hydro Hurricane, Emerald, and finally Crystal Spin Slicer. Let me know what you think. Did I miss any cards? Should I have swapped out the order of some of them? Do write a comment below and tell me if you agree or more likely disagree with my picks. That's it for this video, duelists. Take care and see you next time.